Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this induction session on quality and effective feedback. My name is Dan Roberts and I'm an assistant principal at GEMS Winchester School, Dubai, and I'm the person who's created this session that you're completing right now. Now, as you can see on the screen, the length of this session is anywhere between about half an hour and 45 minutes. And you'll be pleased to hear that you're not going to have to listen to a whole video of me for 45 minutes talking at you. Instead, I hope I've created a session that allows you to feel that you're participating in it. So at various stages, I've created some activities, I've created an article I'd like you to read, for example, and I'll be asking you to pause this video and either reflect on some questions or complete some activities before you hit play again to move on. So I hope you find it something really engaging and something useful in terms of your own professional development. Now let's begin with 3 starter questions. So I'm going to read 3 questions to you, and when I'm done, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and just spend a few moments thinking about what your answers to these questions are. So the first question is a true or false one. You just need to decide, is this statement true or false? And that's, once a student sees a grade on a piece of work, they tend to ignore the written comments made by a teacher. Is that statement true or false? The second question is about educational research and what that says about great learning. So here you have 4 options, A, B, C, and D, and I want you to decide which one of these will produce greater learning. Is it A, if we give prizes for student work? Is it B, we teach more and provide less feedback to students, and we really focus on how we teach? Is it C, we teach less and provide more feedback? And is it D, we should assign students more homework? We should basically give them more homework to do. You need to make your decision in a moment. The third question is a complete this sentence question. And I'm going to give you 3 words to complete the sentence. And the sentence is effective feedback should. What do you think the next 3 words are? So you've seen my 3 starter questions. What I'd like you to do is pause the video, and when you're ready, hit play to see my answers. So you've had a chance to have a look at those questions, so let's have a look at my answers. So for the first question, true or false, once a student sees a grade, they tend to ignore the written comments. That's completely true. Okay, now you might remember back to when you were at school, or you might remember when you've been observed as a teacher recently. And I'm pretty sure that whenever you've been given feedback, maybe on a lesson you've taught, you always want to know, what grade did I get? Was it a great lesson? Was it an outstanding lesson? Was it a good lesson? Was it worse than that? But you're focusing in on the grade, aren't you? And I can tell you from experience that when I've given feedback to teachers and they've asked me what the grade is really early on, I know they're then not going to listen to me about what things have gone well in their lesson and what things I think they could improve. And it's the same for our students, isn't it? When we mark a piece of work they've completed, if we put a grade on it, the students get fixated on that grade. They want to see, is it a good grade, is it a bad grade? If it's good, they think, brilliant, I'm great at this subject. If it's bad, they think, oh, I can't do it, I'm rubbish. And actually, what we really want our students to do is focus on, these are the things you can do well, and this is what you could do better. And putting a grade on there often gets in the way of that. In terms of that second question, according to the research, what will produce greater learning? Well, of those 4, the best thing you could do is teach less and give more feedback on students' work. In other words, get the students to complete activities and give them either verbal or written feedback on how they're doing. But feedback works 2 ways in that sentence, and I've deliberately used the word feedback instead of marking, because you also want to take feedback on what the students can and can't do in your lesson. You might ask them a quick quiz, for example. You might ask them some short multiple choice questions. But you're doing that to gather feedback on how the students are doing, how they're making progress in their learning. And you use that feedback to then adapt your teaching either there and then in the lesson, or in the future lessons you're going to teach that class. And that's one of the best things you can do. So when we use that word feedback, we are sometimes talking about marking, but of course we're also sometimes talking about getting information from your class, from your students, on what they can and can't do. The third part, complete the sentence with only 3 words. I think this is a particularly tricky task, but my 3 words are as follows. So effective feedback should move learning forward. And at the heart of it, that's entirely the point of why we either give feedback to students or take feedback from students, is we want to move their learning on. We want them to progress. We want them to do even better in our individual subjects or topics that we're teaching. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that little starter activity, got your brain warmed up and thinking about feedback well. I just want to run through now the aims for this session. So by the end of this session, I hope that you will be able to explain why feedback is so important for moving learning forward. I also hope by the end of this session that I'll have been able to explain some different tools that you could use to provide really effective feedback to your classes, but also some useful tools that you might get of how you might get feedback from your classes. The third thing is I want to give you the opportunity to reflect on what you already do. And I want you to think about how some of the things I'm going to talk about might enhance the way you give feedback or get feedback from your students so that we have a great impact on student progress. Because after all, that's why we do our jobs, so that students make great progress in their learning. So I now just want to give you, though, the opportunity to do some reflection before we dive into the session. I know you've had a few starter activities, but I now want to give you the opportunity to reflect on assessment, marking and feedback. So I'm going to give you 3 questions, and again, at the end of those 3 questions, I'm going to ask that you pause the video and just have a think about them, and when you're ready, you'll hit play again. So the first thing is, I want you to think about what the difference is between assessment, marking and feedback. What do those 3 different terms mean? How are they similar? How are they different? So try and define those terms. The second reflection question I'd like you to do is try and tell me what you think the 3 most important purposes of assessment, marking and feedback are. So what are the 3 most important purposes of assessment, marking and feedback? Thirdly, I want you to think about some different techniques you could use to provide feedback tasks to students to help them their learning move forward. So by that I mean, what are 3 things you can ask students to do to improve their work? And that really is great feedback. Pause the video. When you're ready and you think you've got an answer to each of those 3 questions, hit play again and I'll talk you through what I think some of the answers are to those questions. So let's have a think then about each of those questions in turn. So the first one, of course, was what's the difference between assessment, marking and feedback? Now, you don't necessarily have to agree with me word for word for these, but I think most people would agree these are quite good definitions of those 3 terms. So assessment is that process of evaluating and measuring the attainment and the progress of students. In other words, it's an exam. I'm trying to do a dipstick of how well my students have learnt the topic I've taught. I think that's what assessment means. Okay, it's certainly what it means to me. Marking is slightly different. That's the process of checking the work to see if it's correct or incorrect, and that might involve putting ticks and crosses on a piece of work. Okay, so you could give a student an exam, that would be the assessment, and you could mark it with ticks and crosses, that would be marking. But if you only ever do those 2 things, I don't think it's going to help the students move their learning forward, which is why the feedback part is so critical. And this is about identifying for the students, these are the things you can do well, these are the things you need to improve, and these are some tasks I now want you to do to move your learning forward. You're going to hear those words and you already have a lot, but move learning forward is the key thing to great feedback. So that's for me what the difference is between those 3 terms, assessment, marking and feedback. Assessment is an exam, marking is ticks and crosses, what did you get right, what did you get wrong, but it's the feedback that's the most important part. What can they do? What can't they do? What are you going to give them to do to help them develop those areas for improvement? In terms of the second question, what do you think the 3 most important purposes of assessment, marking and feedback are? There are literally hundreds of possible answers to these questions, but I'm going to share with you what I think the 3 most important purposes are. So the first thing for me is students should act on feedback to make progress. Okay, it moves learning forward. You see those words again. But if you don't get students to do something and you just tell them this is what you're good at and this is what you need to get better at, how are they ever going to make progress? Okay, you know you're not very good at definitions of coastal erosion. Well, then ask them to go away and revise that. Ask them to create flashcards. Get them to do something. Okay, so students have to act on feedback. That's for me one of the most important purposes. The second thing is that together, assessment, marking and feedback inform my planning and my future teaching. So I'm going to know what I maybe need to go back over with a class if they've misunderstood something. Or actually, they all really get this, so let's push them on and let's challenge them even more. For me, that's really important. The third thing, of course, I think is that students learn the value of hard work and the quality of work they produce. I think we should use our feedback as a way of encouraging students to work really hard, because we know if students don't work hard, they don't tend to learn. Now, that third question on what techniques can you use, again, literally hundreds you could use, but here are three you could think about. So the first is called redrafting or redoing. So this is about a task students could do to improve their work. So you've marked an essay, you've told the students these are the things you can do well, this is what you need to do to improve, and then a really good task is go away and do it. Improve your piece of work by doing the things I've told you you need to improve. Rewrite that final paragraph. Redo your introduction because it's not clear enough. I think getting students to do things is really important. Sometimes though, moving learning forward is about reteaching their lesson. If you've given your students a quick 10 question multiple choice quiz to 30 kids in your class and you found that actually the average score is 2 out of 10, maybe you need to reteach the lesson. Maybe they didn't understand it well enough. Maybe you weren't clear enough in your explanations. So sometimes when you look at how a class has done, you might need to go back and reteach a lesson, okay? And that would be a really good task to help them understand what they didn't understand the first time round. The third thing, of course, is you could relearn material or retest them, okay? So if, for example, you've given students a quiz on different key terms about weather and climate, you can tell I'm a geography teacher with these references, but if you've given them a test and they've got gaps in their knowledge, ask them to go away and revise it and retest them a week later, retest them in a month's time to see if they've relearned it. And I think, again, that's a really fantastic way of helping move learning forward. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the pedagogy behind effective feedback. And I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with the work of John Hattie. John Hattie, for those of you who don't know, is a New Zealand professor who has created a meta-analysis of lots of educational research to try and work out what are the most effective things teachers can do to improve learning. And he has a top 10 list, and within that top 10 list, feedback appears. But what he does say is that feedback can either be a really positive thing and influence learning greatly, or feedback can actually have a really negative impact on learning if it's done badly. So of course then the question is, well, if we know when it's done badly it has a negative impact, we know when it's done really well it has a positive impact, what's a really good way of giving feedback, and let's all try and do it so our kids make great progress. So the most effective feedback, of course, focuses on learning, and importantly, it's given in a timely manner. Now, I think that has led to many teachers across the world feeling the pressure of marking. And by that, I mean teachers take piles of book home and feel like they've got to mark them so that they can give the feedback to students as quickly as possible, because we know the best feedback is feedback that is given as soon as possible after a student has completed the work. And I think that's created a lot of pressure for teachers and made a number of teachers across the world decide this profession maybe isn't for me. So the question is, what do we do about that? Because we know feedback's important, but we know it also creates some pressure for teachers. Well, one of the things I think you can do is something that's called live marking. Okay, and some of you may well be aware of this. I'd like you to go away and read the article that's linked to this session, okay? It's an article all about how you could live mark, what it is and how you do it. What I'd like you to do, go away, read that article. Once you've had a chance to read that article, I'd like you to then start the video again, and I'd like you to hit play so we can talk about it in a little bit more detail. So I hope you found that article interesting and certainly thought-provoking. What I'd now like you to do, having had a chance to read that article, is I'd like you just to conduct some reflections on it. So the first thing is do you think this is an approach you could develop in your own teaching? So why not? The second thing is, can you think of any solutions that can be used to manage the disadvantages of live marking that have been identified in that article? And the third thing is, live marking often works best when you combine it with some marking codes, some sort of shorthand to help the students know exactly what you mean really quickly. So what simple code do you think you could use to teach your students about what they need to do to improve? So I'll give you an example. When I identify a spelling mistake in my students' work, I circle it and I put SP next to it. And I've taught my students to know that means you've made a spelling mistake, look it up and correct your work. When you've had a chance to have a think about those reflection questions, hit play and I'll just give you some of my thoughts on it. So hopefully you've done your reflection now, you've read the article and you've carried out some reflection questions on it. So that first question, do you think this is something you develop in your own teaching? Obviously you'll have a personal response to that, but I can tell you that in my previous role before I joined GEMS, I was part of a senior leadership team who introduced this approach across an entire school. And every single one of our teachers live marked instead of taking their books home. Now, to begin with, I had to stand on the gate with the head teacher, and we used to have to stand there and say to staff, why are you taking your books home? You should be marking them live in lessons, because it's really good for the students, because they get feedback when they need it, as soon as they're doing the work, but it also reduces your workload, because you're not taking piles of books home to mark each night. So it can be done. To begin with, it took us training our staff how to do it. But they all did it, and I can tell you that even though I left that school 2 years ago, I know they're all continuing to live mark because they see how powerful it is for student progress and they see how great it is for their workload. So in terms of some of the solutions that can be used to manage the disadvantages of live marking, there are a couple of things from my experience that I think are really useful. One is you have to build in periods where students are working independently in your lesson, so that you can get around the room and give that feedback to students who need it. So I do this with my classes and I live mark, and I've said to them, there will be times in the lesson where I say to you, right, for the next 20 minutes, I want you to work really hard independently so that I can get around and give you feedback. And because I've been clear about why I'm doing it, I'm not saying you're going to work in silence because I'm a horrible human being, but I'm saying I need you to be quiet and get your head down so that I can give you feedback, because that's so important for helping you move your learning forward. So that's one of the solutions, is you give yourself, you create periods in your lesson where you can get around and mark those work. Other good examples of things you can do is try and mark only, say, 10 or 15 books. If you've got a class of 30 students, try and mark 10 or 15 in one lesson, 10 or 15 in the next, then 10 or 15 in the next lesson, and so on and so on. So you don't necessarily try and mark every book, every lesson, but once every 2 or 3 lessons, you give it some time to go back and give some feedback to those students as and when they need it. And then that last thing about marking codes, I've already talked about spelling and my circling of a misspelled word and the use of the letters SP. You can also do the same for grammar. I've also taught students a little shorthand, which is a question mark. And I put a question mark on their work, and then I say to them, right, I've put a question mark there because I didn't quite understand what you mean. Can you please rewrite it? And I give them some feedback on what they might need to do to improve their rewrite. But that's great feedback. They know that question mark means I need to rewrite it, but I'm then going to verbally tell them how, rather than spending hours writing it out by hand. The students then improve their work live on the spot and then move their learning forward. So there are a range of different codes you can use, and if you Google live marking, okay, you'll see that there's lots of different schools around the world who are introducing this and are doing this really well, and they often share those marking codes for the rest of the world to see as well. So have a bit of a Google and see what you find. Now I just want to move on a little bit, and I want to talk about the use of praise in feedback. I think we would all agree that praise is really important when we give feedback to the students. Of course it is. It's about student motivation. Everyone loves hearing, yeah, good job, keep working. But I just want to mention praise because this is something I commonly see when I look in books, and that's praising outcomes, okay? Where people at the end of a piece of work say, great work, or good effort, or nice job. And I know why they're doing it. They're marking in their books and they're writing that at the end because they want the students to feel good. But if you just write at the end of a piece of work, great work, it doesn't move learning forward. It might be nice for the students to hear that, but it doesn't move their learning forward. But it also praises the outcome of the student's work. So you did this work, great job. It didn't praise the effort. And actually, I don't know if people are familiar with the work of Carol Dweck, who's written a fantastic book about mindsets and about how we develop a growth mindset. In that book, Carol Dweck talks a lot about how we motivate students. And she rightly says we should praise the effort people put into their work rather than the outcome. So instead of saying good work, great job, I'd say thank you for working really hard. Because of that hard work, you produced a really good piece of work. That's a much better way of using praise. Still motivates the students, but you're getting them to see actually it's the hard work that has led to this fantastic outcome, not just you produce a fantastic piece of work. I think that's something really important for everyone to reflect upon. So instead, as it says there, yeah, we should praise effort students put into work, as the research indicates that really does help them develop a growth mindset. So it's not a big thing that I want to spend a huge amount of time talking about, but I do think it is something that's important for everybody to reflect and think about. Now, the next little activity I want us to do is look at some feedback. So in a moment, I'm going to show you two pieces of feedback on the same piece of work. So I've gone and found a piece of work that one of the students in my school has created. It was a blank piece of work, okay, and what I've done is I've marked it in two different ways. So here's the first example, okay, you can see I've put digital marking on it, okay, because my handwriting is terrible, but you can see I've put some marking on that piece of work, and you can then see that I've done this next piece of work with a slightly different way of marking it, where I've not actually commented on the work at all, but I've written some things next to it. Now, just in case you can't see it, the thing on the right-hand side starts with, this is a good start to your narrative about the Battle of Hastings. Your starter shows that, and then you can read the rest of that question. What I'd like you to do is pause the video, and I'd like you just to identify what you think the strengths and weaknesses are of each of those pieces of work. And when you're ready, hit play. So you've looked at those two pieces of work, and I'm hoping, not a great surprise, but I'm hoping you've identified the piece of work on the right-hand side is a stronger piece of work, or a stronger piece of feedback to students. Now, the things on the left-hand side, there are some things that I think are good. I think presentation is really important. So identifying that you want the student to underline the title and learning objective, I think is really important. But I don't think there's much else on there that's great. The ticks might be encouraging. Identifying neat handwriting is nice, saying that's great and giving us 78%, as we talked about, I don't think that's fantastic. But the right-hand side, I think you can see much greater, much better feedback. And one of the things I really like about the right-hand side of marking is it's been very clear with what the students can do, and it's linked it back to the learning objective and the success criteria of the lesson. So the learning objective is about learning to write a narrative account on a historical event, and then they've done that. So you can see the starter activity was all about writing down what they think is a really important part of a narrative account. They've then written a narrative account about the Battle of Hastings. So you can see in that feedback, it says your starter shows you have a clear understanding of the key content and structure of a historical narrative account. That was one of the success criteria for this lesson. So that feedback is linked to what the students should have been able to produce at the end of a lesson. It's also then highlighted that they identified some key events that happened during the Battle of Hastings. That's really positive. But you can then see it tells the student what you need to do to improve, okay? So to improve further, you should add greater detail by explaining William tricking the English into thinking he was retreating was so important for winning the battle. So that this is what you need to do to improve. It then says, also, please check your work for spelling, punctuation, grammar mistakes. And then I've explained, for example, English should have a capital E. Now, I think that's a good piece of feedback, but I don't think it's perfect. Nowhere does it say explicitly, I've identified you need to talk about why William tricking the English is really important and you need to explain it in greater detail. I think it needs a sentence in it. Now do that. Rewrite your work to include an explanation about why William tricking the English into thinking he was retreating was important. So although there's two pieces of feedback there, neither of them is perfect, but I do think one is obviously clearly stronger than the other. Now, very quickly now, I just want to talk through a couple of different strategies you could use. So on the screen at the moment, you have a piece of work that's been marked using the SID approach. And SID stands for Strength, Improvement and Development Task. And this is a routine we use at WSD to provide feedback on students' work. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video and reflect on what do you think is good about this approach? How would you improve it even further? When you're ready, hit play again. So you've had a chance now to have a look at that piece of work, and I do think this is a really nice approach, okay, this idea of SID marking. And as I said, this is something we use at WSD. Now, of course, the comments that are here, I think, could be improved. Okay, so for example, the strength, you can define some key terms of the lesson. That clearly links back to the success criteria. The improvement task, you now need to research details and give examples of each of these. It's a little bit confusing to me. I think you need to be clearer in exactly what you want the students to do. But there is a clear do now task, isn't there? Give some real life examples of misinformation and corroboration. So there is clearly a do now task. Now, I wanted to show you SID marking also to talk about the importance of your school's marking and feedback policy. So every school will have a marking and feedback policy. Part of ours at WSD involves SID marking on key pieces of work. And I'm not suggesting that every school has to use this. Of course, every school will have its own approach. But what is really important is whatever your school's approach to marking and feedback is, you must make sure you stick to it, okay? As a school, as a leadership team, they will have decided what is going to work best in their school. And when we get inspections, they will come in and look at, are we following our policy? And if you're doing your own thing and you're not following the policy, that's not necessarily going to help your school develop, okay? Now, of course, if you think your policy can be improved, every leadership team would love to hear that. So, marking policy is important, stick to them, but if you think they can be improved, talk to people as well. Now, another common system that's used is what went well, even better if, or WWW-EBI. Okay, so this is another piece of work that's been marked in one of our schools, and you can see here that actually it's the students who have given the what went well and even better if. Okay, so in this scenario, there's been some peer marking first, and then you can see some SID marking afterwards. Again, pause the video, have a look at that piece of work, think about what's good, how it could be improved further, and when you're ready, hit play again. So I wanted to show you this example just because there are plenty of things we could talk about in this session, and one of the things we haven't had a huge amount of time to talk about was peer marking or students self-marking their work. I think this is a really powerful way of helping move learning forward, because what you're doing is you're getting the students to think about, well, what would a great piece of work look like? Let me give some feedback to someone else to help them improve. They'll get feedback from their peers, and that really does help move learning on. But what I think is really important is if you're going to ask students to do peer marking, and it's an important piece of work in particular, I think you then need to follow it up with teacher marking as well. Now again, not necessarily all of the things written here and all of the comments are as helpful as others, but I do think this is an interesting approach and something you should think about using in your own teaching. So that really brings us to the end of the session. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've had a chance to achieve the aim. So you'll be able to explain now why feedback is so important for moving learning forward. You'll be able to describe and explain some different tools such as live marking that we can use to provide effective feedback. And you've also had a chance to reflect on what you do and how some of the things that other schools are doing and other colleagues are doing might be able to enhance your own approach to marking and feedback and have a big impact on student progress. So what I'd now like you to do is just complete this short plenary. So pause the video and answer these couple of questions. So has your view on effective feedback changed in this session? Why or why not? And secondly, what do you think is the most important thing about that you've taken from this session, and how might you use it in your new school? Pause the video, have a go at that, and then I just want you to hit play again for one final slide from me with some key takeaways. So you've obviously now had a chance to complete the plenary. Let's then have a quick look at my takeaways from this session, okay? The first thing is, every school in our network will have their own marking and feedback policy. And as we said a few moments ago, you should ensure you read it really carefully and make sure you stick to it. The second thing is, I think that your feedback needs to be clearly linked to the learning objectives and success criteria of the lesson, and that's something I touched upon earlier on. This will really help you make it clear to the students how they can improve their learning further. And I also want you to remember about praise. Praise the effort, don't praise the outcome. And the third key takeaway is the most effective feedback for moving learning forwards requires the students to do something. We talked at the start about redrafting, redoing, or revisiting. And if your feedback doesn't ask the students to do anything, then it's not going to be as effective and it's not going to be as powerful as those teachers who do ask the students to do something to improve their learning. I really do hope you've enjoyed the session. I wish you all the best of luck for starting in your new school. And for those of you joining WSD, I can't wait to meet you all. Thank you, everybody, and take care.